All right, I think we're live. I'm gonna try to manage this. If the audio is not working, let me know. Just have a comment. Try to manage this. Turn down. I've got two iPads here, so I'm gonna try to manage one with the other. If the audio is not working, let me know. I think it is. With the other, if the audio, yeah, it sounds like it is at least. I'm gonna give probably a couple minutes for people to join in before we begin. If you have your Bibles, just go ahead and get those open to 1 Samuel chapter 20, if you don't mind. 1 Samuel chapter 20 is where we're going to pick up. We're going to forego the announcements tonight just because this is being posted online, and just confidentiality of things about that. We're going to forego the announcements tonight. So it sounds like the audio is working, so that's good. But if anything winds up messing up or something with the audio, just let me know, and I can try to get that fixed as best as I can. Again, I hope you all are doing well. If you looked outside recently, you got a lot more snow coming down, and obviously weather conditions aren't great. That keeps us from being able to assemble together tonight. Believe it or not, you might want to prepare yourselves, because I'm kind of ready for winter to be over with too, to a certain degree, after being basically stuck in the house for most of the time for the past few days. Believe it or not, I'm actually ready for winter to move on, and not ready for summer, but ready for a little bit warmer weather to come and arrive here in Mississippi. So I guess we'll go ahead and begin. We're gonna go basically our normal time, 7:10 to 7:15. Our plans tonight are pretty ambitious. We're gonna try to go from verse 9 of chapter 20 all the way down to verse 34. But some of these verses are pretty straightforward, and some of it we'll see towards next week with the end of the chapter, because you've got the plans of David and Jonathan that are going to be put into place. So last week we left off in verse 9. We know that in 1 Samuel chapter 20, we read about David, of course, fleeing from Saul, who had arrived at the city of Ramah to basically try to kill David, right? Because he had heard wind of David being there. Obviously, that doesn't work. We read about Saul, of course, and how that ended chapter 19, his humility. But in chapter 20, we read about David, instead of fleeing from the capital, which would have made a lot of sense, he decides to go and talk to Jonathan about the matter. And we talked about David's integrity, a man that wanted to try to make things right as best as he can. David's very, very admirable in that. But in 1 Samuel chapter 20, we again pick up with Jonathan and David talking. And where we had ended last week concerned, David talking about his relationship with Jonathan, right? In the original covenant that they made back in, I believe, chapter 18. And when we pick up in chapter 9, we pick up in verse 9, Jonathan is reaffirming his loyalty basically in this verse. So in verse 9, and Jonathan said, "Far be it from thee, for if I knew certainly that evil was determined by my father to come upon thee, then would not I tell it to thee." So back in verse 8, when David sort of ended his first response when David had ended that response to Jonathan, if you look at that text, if you look at verse 8, David had brought up again the fact that they had made an original covenant. And the point that David was making to Jonathan is, Jonathan, don't forget the covenant that we've made, because based on that covenant, your loyalties, you've already promised your loyalties to lie with me rather than your own father. And we certainly understand that. And so there we come to in verse 9, and basically Jonathan is just trying to reassure David that there's nothing wrong, right? Jonathan again said, "Far be it from thee, for if I knew certainly that evil were determined by my father to come upon thee, then would not I tell it thee." So, Jonathan's removing the doubt that might be there, that, Jonathan might still have some part of his loyalty back with Saul rather than David. And so Jonathan provides that reassurance to David that there's nothing that you have to worry about, verse 9. So that by verse 10, David wants to know why or how Jonathan is going to relay the message from himself talking to his father. How is Jonathan going to get that message back to David, right? Because David's not accepted, or David does not think he's accepted in Saul's sight. Verse 10, then said David to Jonathan, who shall tell me, or what if thy father answer thee roughly? Right? So, Jonathan, are you going to send a messenger? Right? You could think about that in verse 10, right? Who shall tell me? Right? Are you going to be able to tell me, or is it going to be another messenger that comes along? Because when you look at verse 10, David points out, Saul, based on that answer, may not be a very good answer, or, based on what Saul tells Jonathan, it could very well be the case that, Jonathan is not able to go and to talk to David because of Saul knowing about Jonathan and David's relationship. So, how is this matter going to be? How are you going to let me know, is what David wants to know, verse 10. So, verse 11, Jonathan said unto David, come and let us go out into the field. And they went out both of them into the field. So, what you have here in verse 11, you keep in mind that they're in Saul's court, right? Because that's where, Jonathan resided. So we might think that in order to discuss the details of this plan, there would have been servants of Saul, perhaps within the vicinity where David and Jonathan had talked. And so perhaps they are leaving in a sense to try to get away from people that might want to eavesdrop, that would betray Jonathan and David. But if you look, they went out both of them into the field. This is where, and concerns a lot of the events here in chapter 20 about how David's plan of escape will happen, and as we'll see that moving forward. So by the time we get to verse 11 at the end of it, you have in mind where David wants an answer right away, right? Because he's obviously. We saw in the verse he fled, he ran towards where Jonathan was. David's in a hurry. He wants a sure answer, and you're almost left with a sense of suspense right here, right? Because instead of Jonathan just immediately telling David how he's going to answer, and let David know about Saul's intent, instead he's going to try to. Instead, he goes into the field and doesn't give David a direct answer. So. If you're reading this, there's a little bit of suspense here that's created because Jonathan doesn't give an immediate answer. And the reason why he doesn't is because what happens with this plan works for both Jonathan and David. So, verse 12, they come to the field. Jonathan said unto David, O Lord God of Israel, when I have sounded my father, or when I have searched my father, about tomorrow, any time, or the third day, and behold, if there be good toward David, and I then sin not unto thee, and show it thee, the Lord do so, and much more to Jonathan. But if it please my father to do thee evil, then I will show it thee, and send thee away, that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee, as he hath been with my father. So, if you note verse 12, what Jonathan does here is he makes another oath. And we talked about this last week, but generally when a biblical character invokes the name of God, there's sort of you invoke God's name. A lot of times that is a direct sign of somebody making an oath. And that's what Jonathan does here in verse 12. And Jonathan here is again reassuring his loyalty. Now you note here that Jonathan says, when I have searched my father about tomorrow, any time, or the third day. If you remember last week, we talked about that the festival of the new moon, which is what takes place in this chapter, that it could last for upwards of 2 to 3 days. And so Jonathan here, what you get the idea that Jonathan is telling David is that Jonathan's going to diligently and thoroughly make sure of Saul's intentions. Jonathan's not going to just simply wait back and see what Saul said on day one, or as we're going to see, Saul's not going to say anything about David not being there on day one. And, Jonathan's not going to be hurried or rushed in making a judgment. He's going to be patient, try to be very thorough to get a definite answer back to David. And, credit Jonathan for that, right? Because, a lot of times, maybe a decision like this, you want an answer quick. David wants an answer quick. Sometimes the quickest answer is not always the right answer. And credit Jonathan because he does a good job of, he's going to do a good job of finding out his father's intent, even though it's going to displease Jonathan greatly. You note again verse 12. The end of verse 12, right? If there be good toward David, and I then sin not unto thee, and show it thee, the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. So in other words, what Jonathan's saying there is that if I find out that my father's intent towards you is good, and that he's not trying to kill you, but yet, say I don't send a messenger, or if I don't relay a message to you saying that, my father's happy with you, then that's on me. Right, and you got a picture here of Jonathan taking personal responsibility because, if David doesn't answer Jonathan, as we're going to see the allusion in verse 14, it could have been that Jonathan was put to death, right? And so David would flee, maybe thinking the worst if Jonathan never got back to him. But Jonathan's point is, if I'm going to give you this, if I'm going to go through this entire process, I'm going to figure out what my father's intentions are. But at the same time, if he does have positive feelings, if he's not trying to kill you, don't worry. I'll make sure you know that so that there's no reason for you to flee and in reality not look like a villain or a bad guy in that sense. But again, verse 13, if it please my father to do thee evil, then I will show it thee and send thee away, that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. So the exact opposite, right? If he finds out that Saul's intentions are evil, he's going to tell David to flee. Now you note there at the end of verse 13, this is very important to note, that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. Now what's important there is the verb tense right there at the end of verse 13. The Lord be with thee, right? Present tense. Again, Jonathan notes at this point that God's favor was directly on David's shoulders. The contrast to that, as he hath been with my father, or past tense. So Jonathan at this point recognizes that, at one point in his father's life, God was on his side. God was showing favor to him. But Jonathan, verse 13, recognizes that at this point, if God's favor is on David, then my loyalty should lie with David rather than Saul. And that certainly comes to light here in this chapter. But verse 14, Jonathan's going to turn around and basically give David, though, some responsibilities in this covenant, or basically give David what his part of this needs to be. And so verse 14, Jonathan says, and thou shalt not only while yet I live show me the kindness of the Lord, that I die not. But also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. So basically in verse 14, it begins with Jonathan saying, David, here's your motivation, or here's your motivation for carrying out your responsibilities that are especially given in verse 15. And that's because Jonathan basically implies that he's going to put his life on the line if that means protecting David, if that means preserving David from being killed at the hand of Saul. And thou shalt, again, verse 14, thou shalt not only while yet I live show me the kindness of the Lord. Right, that phrase, while yet I live, indicates to us that Jonathan recognized that what he was going to do very well could jeopardize his life. Now, you think about this, and I know we brought that passage up, I believe, last week or the week before, but, Matthew chapter 10, we talked about how when it came to Jesus and those who were his followers, he talked about the relationship between a person and his parents and how that could be a stumbling block, perhaps, in some ways to those who would want to follow after Jesus. But if you would, turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 10, because I want to talk about the verse that comes after verse 37. So we look at verse 37 of Matthew chapter 10. Jesus says there, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Now, right, and that verse is very clear. We understand that, right? But we often, when we think about that verse, we don't think about what comes after that, right? Verse 38 and 39, he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. He that findeth his life shall lose it. He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. And the point that Jesus was saying is especially as it pertained to that context, was the end result of verse 37. Verse 38, he that taketh not his cross, or to take up the cross, was a metaphorical way of talking about dying. It was a statement. If you took up your cross to follow after Jesus, basically what it meant was that you were willing to die for him, because that's obviously what the cross represented to many in that day. And so that's what Jesus is saying in that passage. You sometimes have to break off allegiance to your father or your mother or your family in order to follow after me. Even if breaking off that allegiance means, if you look in that context, the possibility of dying in the process of that. And of course, there were a lot of, Jewish Christians that died at the hands of some of the Jews we read about in the book of Acts who were persecuting Christians. And in some cases, you would have had, Jewish Christians whose family members were the ones that either turned them in or those that were persecuting them. It was not out of the realm of possibility for that to happen. And so Jesus' point was saying, not only are you expected to put me in front of your own family, but sometimes that could risk, in the first century, sometimes that meant that Christians were risking their lives in doing that to follow after God. And yet here is and you think about that verse, you think about the example of Jonathan here, because Jonathan's already acknowledged that God is on David's side in this matter. And here's a picture of Jonathan willing to put his life on the line, not by siding with his family, but by siding with the man of God. And I think about verse 14, I think about Matthew 10, 37 through 38. And that leads us to the question, do we have that same type of devotion? Because there are a lot of people that, when it comes to religious matters, it's more about what did their family raise them as, or, what religious group did their family always belong to? And that's where people's loyalties lie, is more so with their family rather than doing what's right. Well, Jonathan shows to us that what God expects of us as Christians in part is that he expects us to do what's right, even if that means we don't follow through with our family, right? And that's a very good, a very standout point I think we can draw from the life of Jonathan, verse 14 of 1 Samuel 20. Jonathan's willing to die for David. So verse 15, here's what's required of you. Not only do I not want to die, the end of verse 14, verse 15 again, thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. Know not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. So what Jonathan's pointing out here is something that generally happened at the time. And that was the fact that whenever you had a change in the dynasty of a kingdom, and in this particular case, the transition from the house of Saul to the house of David, a lot of times the new king would kill off the heirs of the old house, of the old royal house. And if you want to put in your Bible, 2 Kings chapter 10, you read about Jehu, who was not a son of Ahab. When Jehu established his dynasty in Israel, he actually killed not just Ahab, but the sons of Ahab, because that was just something that typically happened at the time. But Jonathan does not want that for his house. Verse 15, don't cut them off. Don't cut them off. Now you note here that if you pay attention here, Jonathan is contrasting the kindness of God versus the kindness of man, right? Verse 14, Jonathan wanted to see the kindness of the Lord. The kindness of man is not often the same as the kindness of the Lord. And I put in my Bible, Matthew chapter 23, verses 34 through 36, where, Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, and he was talking about, how they and their ancestors had put to death the prophets, right? And how that angered God, because it brings up the point that God does not like to see those who are doing right be killed or put to death, right? And Jonathan is a man who's doing right by his actions here. And so, Jonathan does not want not just himself, but he also doesn't want his family to be killed in a horrific way that often happened whenever you had a transition of power like this. And 2 Samuel chapter 9, you actually see David, and as 2 Samuel 9 verse 3 indicates, David showed the kindness of the Lord to Jonathan's house by preserving Jonathan's son. Mephibosheth was his name. But what Jonathan requests in verses 14 and 15, you can find that in 2 Samuel chapter 9, where David shows mercy to his house. Right, so now verses 16 and 17, simply a new covenant is formed. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And really, the only thing I'll say about verses 16 and 17 is that now the covenant is not just between David and Jonathan, but it's between their families. And David, as we mentioned in a minute ago, David's going to uphold his part of the covenant with Jonathan's family in 2 Samuel chapter 9. All right, so we come down to verse 18, right? So now David's going to get his answer, right, about how Jonathan's going to inform him about what Saul's intentions are towards David. All right, so verse 18. Jonathan said to David, tomorrow is the new moon, and thou shalt be missed, because thy seat will be empty. And when thou hast stayed 3 days, then thou shalt go down quickly, and come to the place where thou didst hide thyself when the business was in hand, and shalt remain by the stone Ezel. All right, so Jonathan is pretty sure again that David will be that David's absence will be noticed, right? You know, verse 18, thou shalt be missed because thy seat will be empty. He's pretty sure of that. Let me see where I'm at in my notes. So if we're thinking about the time frame here, that's important because this can be a little bit confusing. Right, so we have 3 days. Verse 19, when thou hast stayed 3 days. The 3 days would have been the day, the present day where Jonathan's talking to David. That's the first day. And then the 2 days after that. So the indication is that David is going to leave, more than likely to go back to Bethlehem, which, we talked about that at the beginning of the chapter. David's going to go to Bethlehem today, or that day that they're speaking. And then he's going to come back the day after tomorrow. So that's sort of how the 3 days are laid out here. Again, that can be a little bit confusing because you generally would think about the 3 days. The first day would be after when they're speaking, but actually the day that they are speaking is the first day in this timeline here. So you again note that they are. You again know that David is going to go away. Come to the place where thou didst hide thyself when the business was in hand. Again, that's a reference back to 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 2, where, Jonathan, and in that passage, Jonathan had first mended the relationship between David and Saul in that passage. And we read about David hiding in a secret place, potentially within the field. That could very well be the same place that's being talked about here in verse 19. The stone easel. The name easel just simply means departure. And to avoid confusion, this is not the same word as Ebenezer, which means a helping stone. I know the song, O Thou Fount of Every Blessing, Ebenezer is one of the words there, and it just means a helping stone. The word easel means departure. And if you've read through this chapter before, you note at the end of it, there's a dramatic parting between David and Jonathan, which is maybe where the name easel came from. But either way, that's where they're going to meet up once this has ended. Once David has more than likely come back from Bethlehem 2 days from when they're speaking. All right, so verse 20, here's the method how Jonathan's going to alert David about what has happened. Verse 20, I will shoot 3 arrows on the side thereof as though I shot at a mark. And behold, I will send a lad, saying, Go, find out the arrows. If I expressly say unto the lad, Behold, the arrows are on this side of thee, take them, then come thou, for there is peace to thee and no hurt, as the Lord liveth. But if I say thus unto the young man, Behold, the arrows are beyond thee, go thy way, for the Lord hath sent thee away. And as touching the matter which thou and I have spoken of, behold, the Lord be between thee and me forever. So, Saul would naturally be suspicious, right? Again, we've mentioned Saul already knows about Jonathan and David's relationship. If David was to all of a sudden be gone, if Jonathan were to all of a sudden leave without saying much of anything, perhaps that doesn't look good. But the plan that Jonathan sets here would be very inconspicuous. We know that Jonathan's a soldier. We read about his military actions back in chapter 14. Would not be uncommon for a person to go out and to get target practice, so to say, or to train. And that's sort of the premise. That would be the reason why that would make this an inconspicuous encounter. Because it would not be uncommon for Jonathan, who is a soldier, to and has military experience, to go out and to train, to target practice. And we'll talk about this more next week when we talk about this specific event. But basically what happens is, depending on where the arrows land, that's going to be the message to David about whether he's supposed to stay or go. If the arrows land to the side of David, that's an indication that Saul is extending his good favor to him. If they go beyond David, that's the indication that David is supposed to flee. And again, we'll talk more about that next week as we talk about that. As we talk about that in particular detail. All right. So verse 24, that first phrase. So David hid himself in the field. This is that first phrase is actually a reference to when David came back to meet with Jonathan. It's not as though David was hiding there in the field for 3 days while the events of verses 24 down through 34 happened. So that's something to keep in mind. So verse 24, the latter half of that verse, we note this as the first day of the feast of the new moon, when Jonathan begins to figure out about his father's intentions toward David. All right, so verse 24, so David hid himself in the field. When the new moon was come, the king sat him down to eat meat. And the king sat upon his seat, as at other times, even upon a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side, and David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul spake not anything that day, for he thought, something hath befallen him, he is not clean. Surely he is not clean. So the food here, we've talked about this, the Feast of the New Moon. Generally, sacrifices were offered. Perhaps the feast was actually the partaking of the meat that had been that was supposed to go back to the individual that was to be eaten by that family. And we talked about 1 Samuel chapter 1, right, with the feast between Elkanah, Hannah, and Elkanah's family. The feast that they were eating there, the meat probably came from sacrifices. That's something common with sacrifices. And so it indicates to us, though, that Saul is still a religious man, right? We know that God's favor has departed from him, yet Saul is still a religious man, but he's not in God's favor. And that's you think about that, that's a point of application that we could point out here that may not be evident on the surface. Saul is still a religious man, but just because you're religious doesn't mean that you're automatically right in God's sight. That's a statement that a lot of people need to hear. A lot of people that claim Christianity need to hear. Just because you do a lot of things, just because you think you are religious by the world's standards, that doesn't automatically mean that you are in good standing with God's sight. Because you can think of a lot of other individuals, the Israelites. We've been talking about the book of Amos. We're going to talk about that, as we move forward throughout that book. The Israelites were not a people that were suddenly not religious in the time of Amos. They were very religious, but at the same time, they were not pleasing in God's sight, just like Saul is not here. And that all traces back to the fact that Saul would not submit to God's will to do what God says. And, for us, we can be very religious, but if we don't have the willingness to submit and do exactly what God says about religious matters, well, we're not going to be in God's favor no matter how much good we're doing. And how much, devotion we're showing to God, or how much we show up at worship service, things like that, if we're not doing what God said. So again, Saul's a very religious man, but he's not in God's favor. So who's present there. Verse 25, David's not there, but Jonathan's there, and Abner is with Saul as well. Now we know Abner to be the captain of Saul's army. And the more that we come through this book, towards the end of the book, we'll start to read a lot more about Abner. He becomes a pretty important character by the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel. So verse 26, Saul's reasoning for David's absence, pretty clear. Again, this is the first day. Saul thinks that something hath befallen him. He is not clean. Surely he is not clean. A lot of times when we think about uncleanliness in the Old Testament, we think about either, having a sickness or especially having leprosy, right? And sometimes we think about that because of maybe an event like, I can't remember, I think it's Luke 17, where you read about the 10 lepers, right? They had to declare themselves unclean. So a lot of times when we think about uncleanliness connected to the law of Moses, we think about leprosy, but one could become unclean from a number of different ways. And the indication here is not that Saul thought that David was suddenly sick or that he had leprosy, but there were some things that a person could do where they were only unclean for basically a day. For instance, Leviticus chapter 7, verses 20 through 21. We don't have time to read that, but you might want to put that down out beside this verse, because in that passage, it records that an individual could not attend a feast if he was declared unclean. And the uncleanliness that's being talked about there was over in a day, is the indication there. That's Leviticus 7, verses 20 through 21. Now we know from Leviticus 11, 27 through 28, that say if a man went and accidentally touched a dead animal, that would make him unclean for basically a day. And he would have to go wash, and then he would, by the end of that evening, he would basically be declared clean. But he would be unclean for a day. And that's what Saul's thinking about here. Perhaps David has accidentally touched an unclean animal, and that's why he's not here tonight, because he's following that regulation. So that's very important, because we come to verse 27. This is the second day. And it came to pass on the morrow, which was the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said unto Jonathan his son, Why has the son of Jesse not come to me, neither yesterday nor today? And so Saul's expectation for David to be there the second day would show to us that Saul simply assumed that David didn't have leprosy, he didn't have any major sickness, but that he did something accidentally, like what's described in Leviticus chapter 11. And so that's why Saul questions Jonathan here. Why is the son of David not here? So that's where Jonathan again reaffirms what David had said back at the beginning of chapter 20, David's reason for not being there. Verse 29, Jonathan answered, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, Let me go, I pray thee, for our family hath a sacrifice in the city, and my brother he hath commanded me to be there. And now if I have found favor in thine eyes, let me get away, I pray thee, and see my brethren. Therefore he cometh not unto the king's table. So you note here in verse 28 and verse 29 that David says he's gone back to Bethlehem. Now, if you note verse 29, you note the phrase there, my brother, he hath commanded me to be there. Of course, David's brother that he would be referencing here would be Eliab, because Eliab is the oldest brother. Generally, what we see in the Old Testament is that sometimes the oldest brother would become the head of the family if either the father has died or if the father has retired. Now we know from 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 through 3, that at this point, Jesse has not died. But if we look back to 1 Samuel chapter 17, where we see Jesse's sons going off to war, the reason why Jesse didn't go to war was because of his older age. So perhaps by this time, Jesse's not in a position where he can sort of handle things as the leader of the family. And so a lot of those responsibilities have turned over to Eliab. If you want to see another, might have had some internet issues there, but if you want to see another example of that in your Bible, Genesis chapter 24, verse 50, you read about Laban and Bethuel discussing whether or not they're giving Rebekah to Isaac. Bethuel was, I believe, Rebekah's father. Laban was Rebekah's brother, but they both collaborated on that decision, probably because Laban, being the oldest sibling, part of his responsibility was to help the father leading the family. So, what's being described here by David would not be uncommon, right? If Eliab sort of become the head of the family instead of Jesse, Eliab would have a certain authority to be able to call David to enjoy or to celebrate this feast and to observe the sacrifices in David's hometown with his family. However, verse 30, Saul is not happy with this. Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? We're going to wrap this section up. We'll be done here within the next 5 to 6 minutes. So Saul lashes out, right? His anger is pretty clear here in verse 30. Saul says there's really not a justifiable, and Saul's just indicating here there's not a justifiable reason for David to not be here. However, when you think about David's position, there was no law from God that stated that David had to be with the king to eat with the king, right? David was, there was no law that required David to be there. Likewise, when you think about the offering of sacrifices, when we think about the period of the temple, right, we know that worship was supposed to be conducted in the temple. But at this time, it appeared that God allowed people to make sacrifices in different places. If you recall 1 Samuel 16, when Samuel went to go see David, Samuel was worried about Saul finding out what Samuel was doing. And so God said that, if Saul asked, tell him that you are going to Bethlehem to offer sacrifice. Right? So it's not like David is in the wrong because he's offering a sacrifice in Bethlehem rather than in the capital. So there's really no justifiable reason for Saul to lash out at David like this. You note here that he lashes out specifically at Jonathan. He calls him a perverse, rebellious, the son of the perverse, rebellious woman. This is just a way of indicating an insult. It's one thing to call somebody rebellious, but in this time, if you were to insult their relatives in the same process, that was sort of trying to create a harsher insult. For instance, you think about John chapter 8, right, where Jesus is talking about the scribes and the Pharisees there. And in that passage, they kept talking about how they're the father, or that they were the children of Abraham. And you recall that in that passage that Jesus, as he's, critiquing them, he says in John 8, verse 44, not only you're bad, but you are of your father, the devil. You are the children of the devil in that sense. And that was to try to get across the point to them, about how serious their condition was. Well, Jesus had a right to say that, right? But Saul, in this particular case, did not. And he makes this very harsh insult towards Jonathan because by the end of verse 30, Saul simply says, you have betrayed the family in order to protect David. And Saul doesn't understand that because verse 31, for as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And so Saul basically says, well, if you're going to protect David, that doesn't make any sense at all, because the longer that David's alive, or if David continues to be alive, that means that you, Jonathan, you're not going to have a kingdom, right? That means David's going to be the next king. But credit Jonathan, because here's an individual that was more concerned about doing what was right than obtaining wealth. He was more concerned about doing what was right than obtaining power. He was more concerned about doing what was right, even if it meant sacrificing a lot of pleasant things in his own physical life. And, we talk about the devotion of David a lot, but, Jonathan's a very good example to look at. Here's a man that was willing to sacrifice a lot of his own desires and ambitions if it was not in conjunction with what God wanted. And that's something that we as Christians have to do as well at times in our life. We have to sacrifice our desires, our ambitions, if that keeps us from doing what God wants. And it's going to benefit Jonathan and his house for doing so. So verses 32 through 34, let me see. I'll just make this note here, verse 32. Jonathan answered Saul his father and said unto him, why shall he be slain? What hath he done? And Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. All Jonathan wanted to note in verse 32 was to hear from Saul what had David done that warranted his death. And instead of giving words or providing a reason, verse 33, Saul's response is give in to his wrath and try to stir up strife. Jonathan was a man who